Now we're going to make some modifications to our jump. Our current jump makes our player bounce up every time we click. I can keep clicking as much as I want, but I can't hold and jump. I don't have a whole lot of control over it. So what we're going to do is modify our jump code, add in a member variable, and take a look at some timing. Let's stop playing and open up our script. To do that, I'm just going to double click on one of my log entries down here just to show you another way that we can open up scripts. Double click a log entry and it'll actually take you to the script at the specific line where that log was being written. Notice that my cursor is right here at the end of that debug.log line. If it doesn't work the first time, sometimes you just got to double click on it again. Sometimes it's opening up the project for the first time or something. So let's continue on by looking at our code. The code that does the jumping is here on line 21 and 22. We check to see if the player has pressed the fire 1 button, which remember a moment ago we looked at was bound to the left click on your mouse, or I believe it was left control. And if they have pressed that in this frame, then we'll set their vertical up to 5. Otherwise, we set their vertical to the current velocity. So it just continues to fall down. So what is this doing? Well, it's only checking when we press the button. Let's change it real quick and get rid of the word down here. There's actually a get button method, a get button up, and a get button down. Let's just change it to be get button though, and I'll hit Control S and save. Make sure that that star goes away. Make sure it's spelled exactly right. Jump over to Unity, and guess what's going to happen if I hold my button down now? Well, I'll let you guess. I'll let you try it out, and then see if you guessed right. So we start to play and we fall and I hold the button down, and look at that. I continue to go up for as long as I hold the button down. And that's because the get button method is checking to see if I'm still holding the button down, or if the button is down this frame, where get button down is checking to see if the button was pressed down this frame. It's a little bit confusing. Again, you don't need to worry too much about these because we're going to move on to the new input system shortly after this. But for now, let's just remember that get button down is for pushing it down, or the event when it fires or when it's pushed down, the frame when it's pushed down. Get button up is for the frame when it's released. So if you release the button, you can have it do a jump on release. Or get button is the one for checking to see if it's currently down this frame. It'll be true for every single frame. All right, let's go back into the code. So we now know how to check to see if the fire button is being held down. Now, how do we make it so that we can only hold the fire button down for a certain amount of time? Because I want the player to be able to jump and hold the jump, but maybe only for 1 second or something. I don't want them to be able to hold it indefinitely. Well, to do that, we're going to need to keep track of when the player started jumping. And we know how to track when the player started jumping, or we should have a good idea, because we just talked about it a moment ago. We can use the get button down method to see when they've started jumping, keep track of that time, and then use that time in our calculations to see if they can continue jumping or not. So let's add in a new line here above line 21. So right after 20, I'm just going to add in a line so I have a little bit of space. And here, let's check to see if the player has pressed the fire button this frame. So that means that they've started the jump. If they have, then we'll keep track of when they can release the jump, or when the jump has to end, I guess is really the way that I want to say that. So say if input.getButton down. Remember, this is the one that fires off whenever the button is clicked for the first time for the frame, or the first frame that it's pressed down. So we'll put in fire 1. So if the fire 1 button is pressed, we want to run the line of code right after it. And that line of code is going to say that our, let's see, jump end time is equal to time.time plus, and let's just add a 1 here. So we're going to add 1 second to the current time. So our jump's going to end 1 second from now. That's the longest we can hold it. I'm going to add in an extra line by hitting enter, and then notice that our jump end time doesn't exist. So we need to create this variable for our jump end time, and we're going to create this variable as a member variable. So instead of it being something inside of our update loop, where we have here this update method where we have, for instance, our var horizontal and our var vertical, we can't do a var jump time or jump end time equals 0 here, because if, or we'd have to put an F because it's going to be a floating point value. We'll talk about that in a moment. We can't do this here because this jump end time would get reset every single frame. So every frame, the code would run through, jump end time would get created, set to 0, and then the time would get checked to, or maybe get set here. And this would not work at all. We need to keep track of jump end time across update loops. So we're going to delete this line 21 here that I've added there. And I'll hold shift and delete to delete out those extra lines. Shift delete will actually delete whatever line you're on. Just make sure you're on the correct line. Remember, you can always Control Z to undo, Shift delete to delete those lines. So we need to make jump end time into a member variable. And there's something special that I do when I create member variables. And that's I go to the beginning of them and I usually add an underscore with shift and the key, it's next to 0. Adds a little underscore there. And this just is an indicator for me that this variable is something that's going to be used across multiple methods. It's not just a method or a variable that's for this method only. So to create this member variable, there are a couple things that I could do, a couple different options. One, I could copy the name of it and then go up kind of to the top of my script here, paste it in with writing the code. I'll show you how to do that later. Because the other way that you can do it is just hit Alt-Enter and then hit Generate Field. This looks a little bit different in every editor, but it's pretty much the same. It's always available. There's always a Generate Field option. We'll just hit Generate Field, and you'll see that I now have a private float, which is a floating point number. It's essentially a number that has decimal points. There's a little bit more to it, but just think of it as a number with decimals versus an int, which is a number without decimals. We've got our variable name, jump end time, and notice that this is inside of this player class squiggly brace here. So there's an opening squiggly brace at the end of our player class definition or declaration, and there's the variable here inside of it. We also have our start method in here. We haven't really talked about that one yet, but it's up here. We can kind of ignore it for now. Let's look at the update. The update method that we've been using is also inside of this squiggly brace. The main thing to note here is that this variable is inside the class. It's part of the class, but it's not part of the method. You see how I look inside update, it's not part of the method. So it's going to be stored and kept along or persisted indefinitely as long as this object is around, not updated and recreated every single frame. So now that we have that time, we need to actually use it. And to use it, we're going to modify the if statement on line 26. Remember, this statement checks to see if the player is still holding down the fire button, and if so, it runs the code on the next line, 27, that sets our vertical to 5 so that we go upward. What we want to do, though, is check to see if they're holding the button and if it's not past the jump end time. So if the current time is not greater than or past or beyond the jump end time. And we can do that in an if statement by adding a double ampersand after the first condition. So our first condition is this input.get button fire1 all the way up to the ending parenthesis right there, that middle right in between them. So we'll just add a space between the two parentheses and add 2 ampersands, shift 7, and we'll check to see if jump end time is greater than time.time. So if jump end time is sometime in the future, anytime up to 1 second from when we initially set it, then we'll allow our player to continue jumping. If that's not the case, so say jump end time is at 1 and our current game time is at 2, then, well, we can't jump because we've already started falling. We should have landed. Let's take a look at that in practice and see how this actually works. So we'll save, Control S to get rid of that star, minimize our window, go back into Unity, and then press play. We should expect to see that we can jump up and then start to fall down automatically. We can still click and spam click all the way up if we want. We haven't stopped that, but my maximum jump should now be about 1 second. There we go. I click and hold and I fall after about a second. Now that that looks good, let's go modify it a little bit and make that jump half as high. So I'm going to go back to our code, and when we modify our jump end time or set our jump end time here on line 24, we're adding 1 to the current time so that we can jump for up to 1 second into the future. Let's make this half a second. To do half a second, we just need to put a value that's half of 1 or 0.5. Whoops, got to get it on the right spot on my keyboard. 0.5. Get my semicolon there, and notice that we've got a little error here. What it's actually telling us is that this 0.5 is a different data type. It's a double and not a float, and jump end time wants a float. It's nothing that you really need to worry too much about. We'll talk more about data types and numbers later. You just need to know that when you see this, you need to add an F, just so that it knows that you want this to be a 0.5 that's a float, not the 0.5 that's not a float, so that it can actually work. So if you see that error again, remember, just try adding that F to your 0. We'll save, get rid of the star, minimize, and let's go see if our jump is now cut in half. That's what you should expect to see. So hit play. And we hold the button, and look at that. Now I'm jumping, I would say, about a reasonable height. So let's stop playing, go back into Plastic SCM, and commit our change. So that we added a maximum jump time to the player. And we'll check in our changes.